Hello, my name is Kevin Paprick, and I'm going to go through a demo showing how you can add generic compute, whether it's Dell, HP, or any other brand, into a generic vCenter. So I have an old vCenter that's been created. This is running 6.7 on some 5 to 6 year old NetApp Evo Rail nodes, and I'll add a generic compute node into it that looks and feels just like a NetApp HCI NDE deployment. To get started, the first thing you are going to want to do is edit the scale vars file and edit this to your environment that you're going to be connecting into and performing these operations on. After this is done, we can kick off the script and we can make connections into our vCenter and SolidFire, which is step number 1 here. This part is now completed and we can see that we're connected to the correct SolidFire cluster as well as vCenter. So the next step is going to be to create these new vCenter objects. So if we went back in, we could see that we have that generic compute cluster. We do not have any VDS switch set up, or we don't have a NetApp HCI specific one. So we'll go back and start step 2 to create these new data center objects into that vCenter. So it's showing you the variables that we'll be leveraging for this step and verifying that they're correct. We don't need to quit, so we'll continue here. And does this data center currently exist? It does not. So we will just go and create it, which is now done. And does that vCenter cluster exist within the data center? No, it does not. So we now just added a new data center and compute cluster into it. And the next question is, do we want to create a new VDS switch for this setup? Yes, we do. We can see the different variables that will be set during this, the VLAN configuration, everything coming from that scale vars file. We don't need to quit to edit it, but if we did, we could just go back into step 2, say that we already have the data center created, the compute cluster, and just start at the VDS setup from here. And this is now kicked off, and it is adding that HCI VDS-like distributed switch into this generic vCenter. So as we go back into vCenter, you can see the data center created, a new cluster, and going over to our distributed switches, we can see this VDS02 created with the different port groups that match that of a NetApp HCI NDE deployment. This step is now completed, so the next step is going to be to add an ESXi host into it. And the first question here is, are you going to do this to a new VDS? If you say no here, it's expecting the NetApp HCI default VDS, as if you were scaling a NetApp HCI cluster with generic compute, but instead here, we're integrating directly into a generic vCenter, so we're going to say, yes, we are, as we just created that switch. Now it's just verifying the fully qualified domain name or IP address of that host we're adding. When I first tried running this, I used the wrong credentials, so I will start over with step 3 again. And this process has now started, where we're first adding that generic compute node into vCenter. We will then migrate all of the network connections for the 2 uplinks into this NetApp HCI-like virtual distributed switch that we created in the previous step. So as part of this, it's now going to be confirming your VMNIC number. So that's going to be specific to the compute node. So you'll want to make sure you're grabbing the correct VMNICs that you want to use. And then also confirming the port group destinations. These are all correct. So I am continuing. Next, we're going to be entering the IP information in for this new ESXi host for iSCSI as well as vMotion. As a last step, we enabled iSCSI and set up port binding. Going over to vCenter, we can see this is all now set up with this generic compute node added, just like a NetApp HCI environment under the NetApp cluster 02, bringing this in, and we can see that it is now connected to that virtual distributed switch that we created with 2 uplinks to look very similar to what you would configure with a 2-cable NetApp HCI setup. Going over to storage adapters, we can see that we have the iSCSI adapter created, but there are no targets right now. That is as we want it. And going to data stores, we just have that local data store. Going back to our automation, the next step we need to now perform is setting up the SolidFire connections to this cluster and add any additional data stores. This step will now create a new account that matches the name of the cluster. It's also going to create a number of volumes and set these up as data stores. It will also add this to an access group that you can define and then fully set up the ESXi configuration so that this new host or hosts within this cluster are now connected into our NetApp SolidFire storage. So we're going to continue with this, and we don't need to change any of these values. So we'll create one data store, 1 terabyte in size with these specific QoS settings. And this is now started, creating those volumes, putting them into an access group, bringing that initiator in, and integrating that SolidFire storage into your vCenter. Going over to vCenter, we can see our new data store that has been created, NetApp Cluster 02. And going over to storage adapters, we can see that iSCSI server is now configured. And looking at the storage side, we could go to our management, see that volume that we created, as well as going to access groups, which we created a new access group that's named the same cluster name with its 1 active volume and 1 initiator. All of this automated, bringing this in and fully setting up that configuration to have a NetApp HCI-like configuration on a generic vCenter.